different opinions. And believe me, it doesn't matter if you're looking at just strictly straight news or more left-leaning articles or some that are right-leaning. There was criticisms, and everybody seems to have a comment and an opinion about what the meaning of this new exhortation is. But as I look at it, I think so much, I look at Francis and remember that Christ said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." One of the things that occurred to me is many times as I've read that, it didn't occur to me that Christ was telling us that hell is going to attack us. It won't prevail, but he wouldn't have had to say that if he didn't tell us we didn't need to be ready for attacks. But what does this new document from our Pope say? I'm going to have to admit that I did exactly what the Holy Father said not to do. I read it very quickly. And I'm going to have to read it over and over and over to get the gist of it. How many of you have read it or looked at it? A couple of you. Well, I think it's very fair to say that our Holy Father really kept strong and reinforced the doctrine that's been there forever. He quoted Humana Vitae, which is so very important to me, and upheld the Church's teaching against contraception and the warnings that Humana Vitae held. He confirmed that marriage remains between a man and a woman. Everything that, all the things related to family, he's still holding. But he's just looking at it with a new light and trying to find good ways to apply it to our current life. I think in my own lifetime being a Catholic, with the pontiffs that we've had, I think we are so very fortunate. While Pope Paul VI was the Pope I remember growing up, I was too little to really pay attention to what he said. And it wasn't until many, many, many years later that I learned the wisdom of Humana Vitae. But St. Paul, John Paul II, and Benedict, and now Francis are the ones that I remember and relate to and look up to as I've been growing up. And I think so much with these three men, how blessed we are. Christ said he is the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that's what's reflected in these last three pontiffs. John Paul II, with his massive writings, and I think truly showed us the way, especially in my practice. Gleaming things from his teaching on theology of the body has meant so much to me and has formed me and led me to practice according to our faith. Benedict is such a brilliant theologian, and I absolutely love reading Benedict. And when I think about Jesus of Nazareth series, how much it introduces us and teaches us the reality of who Christ was and who Christ is. But now we've got the way and the truth that Benedict showed us. I think what Francis is doing for us now is the life. He's trying to teach us how to take these foundations that have been laid and apply it and how to live. There have been some controversy, and people are saying, as far as this apostolic exhortation, that, maybe he's putting some of our doctrines on shaky ground and maybe leaning a little bit too much that his statements were ambiguous and open to a little much interpretation. And people wondered if that's going to weaken our faith. But what I think about Francis is he truly is the shepherd who likes to get on the smell of his sheep. He truly does walk among the people, and he truly, truly loves his people. And as he talks in the apostolic statement about not being too judgmental and being too strict to apply our rules. I think he speaks as one who is actually related to people face to face, who feels their pain, so to say, and is looking for a way to remedy that. I remember very early in my career when I was still a student, I was faced with the first time that I had to visit with someone who was contemplating an abortion. This was a young woman who was 15, who was from an abusive home, and had found herself 15 weeks pregnant. And this young woman was scared to death. I truly, truly think she was afraid that her father would literally kill her. And boy, if your heart doesn't go out to her, my heart bled for this young woman. And there didn't seem to be a really good answer. We could sacrifice the life of the child. We could put her life in jeopardy. If we sent her to a shelter to protect herself from her family, she'd essentially have been a runaway and out on her own. There didn't seem to be a good answer. And how can you look at someone and not feel the pain and not understand that the decision she was made as she was seeking an abortion was not one that was made easily. And even if she didn't believe abortion was right, she didn't see a choice. I think this is the kind of situation our Holy Father is asking us to be understanding with and pastoral with, and to help guide people. As we go on, however, let's think about what is the state of the family. It's been the last 2 years, 2014 and 2015, that we had synods on the family, and this exhortation is just bringing the summary of their findings and recommendations. But what is the state of the family these days? What kinds of things are we facing that led up to this? I think in our world of secularism and relativism, we're finding that people are lacking formation. People in general, and Catholics in specific, studies are showing these days that, let's take living in irregular situations, which was a big portion of the new exhortation. What kind of irregular situations are we talking about? We're talking about cohabitation. There was a big part about people who've been civilly divorced and remarried. We're talking about same-sex unions. How do we reach people and meet them where they are and still love them and bring them into the church and guide them so that they can regularize their irregular situations? A lot of this is calling on clergy to lead the way, but don't we all have a role here? I think of this every day in my office. My first 3 patients today, Catholic, 3 children, tubal ligation, not married. You know, they're coming into me to see some menstrual difficulties, and I'm dealing with them as a gynecologist. But in my heart, I'm asking myself, what is my role to bring them into the fullness of the church in their irregular situations? I don't have the answers to that at all. I need help. But as we look at dealing with their medical problems, in my mind, I'm wondering, what am I doing? Because this life is temporary. What can we do to bring people into fullness with God and help them reach the ultimate goal? I think that's what we all need to ask ourselves, and I think that's what a Catholic apologetic group is. I think we're all called to minister. As we look, some of the slides I would have had prepared if I had this. Let's talk about changing views on sex. How many people in this day and age think that sex outside of marriage is okay? The majority of them, and I'm going to have a real hard time remembering numbers without looking at that, but most people do. Yeah.
If you would like, what you can do is you can email that to one of us, and we can open it up on our web account and put it on the projector.
Okay.
If you'd like to do that. 'Cause that'd be-
I only have it on my jump drive in my car.
Oh, you don't have a computer? Okay.
No, I don't, I'm sorry, I filled it up, I was doing it on a different computer, so. At any rate, it's, back in the turn of the last century, it would have been unheard of to cohabitate. And with each successive generation, it's increased and increased. In fact, if you look from 1950s to now, in the last 15 years, the rate of cohabitation has increased by 1,000%. That's an incredible increase and just a complete turnaround. But how do we get the message to people that that's not in the plan that God had laid out for us? Likewise, divorce rates, they were going up and up and up and up until right about the 1900s to 1990s to 2000s. Since then, marriage rates have gone down. And that just kind of corresponds. More people are cohabitating, fewer people are getting married. But divorce rates are now about up to 50%, 40 to 50%. Catholics fare a little better in that. Overall, Catholic divorce rates are about 28%. And if it's a Catholic married to a Catholic, the divorce rate, I think, is about 26%. If a Catholic is married to a Protestant, it's in the upper 40s. And so Catholics married to Catholics actually fare pretty well compared to the rest. But still, that's still a large number for a sacrament that Jesus told us cannot be divided. So how do we teach people? Part of the apostolic exhortation tells us we need to really improve our premarital counseling, and that we do.
Dr. Church, sorry to harp on this. Would you, if you're comfortable with it, this is fine. If not, that's fine too. You could give your keys to me, and I could run out and go grab it from your car.
You know what? We're fine.
Okay, cool.
We're going to just talk, and I'm going to finish up with what I'm saying, and then I'll just open it up for questions. Okay?
I'll give you the option.
Oh, no, thanks. That's good. That's all good. So as we go on, then, what other things are we facing? We're facing marriage and divorce. We're facing irregular situations. Attitudes about birth control have changed. And through Humana Vitae and St. John Paul II and Benedict have all said that marriage is supposed to be open to life. And none of that changing remains and has been reaffirmed. But yet, if you look at popular news agency things, they'll tell you that 98% of Catholics have contracepted. That's a lot. That's a lot.
Can I interject on that? That statistic is true.
But I'll
okay.
let Glenn just finish. If you look, that statistics actually comes from Guttmeyer, who does the research arm of Planned Parenthood initially. When they did their questions, they were asking only people between the ages of 15 and 44 who were not planning a pregnancy. And so that already eliminates people who are already pregnant or trying to conceive. If you look at that, it said that only 2% of those couples who are trying to avoid were using natural family planning as a method. About a third of them were using the pill, about a third of them had been sterilized, IUDs, and no method made up the rest of them. So it really is, the 98% overestimates. But if our teaching is true, that sexual union is to be open to life, it's still a lot of people who haven't been catechized or who don't understand and don't embrace the beauty of what the church teaches. So we need to do a better job of explaining and do so in love. That's what we're asked to do. If we go back, how do we explain that to people? What can we tell them? First of all, through NFP training, we're taught that we can just stay with plain statistics and stick to the science. And that's important for some people. Sticking to science, first of all, NFP works. And user effect, actual statistics will tell us that it can be 95+% effective if used according to the rules. And that doesn't mean BAFTing. BAFTing means barrier methods during the time of fertility. But that means using the infertile days and abstaining during fertile days if you have a reason not to conceive at that point in the cycle. So it's effective, and it's safe, and it's cost effective, and it has advantages. We can also educate people about side effects of birth control. And if we're talking about birth control pills, we can talk about risks of blood clots, risk of heart disease, risk of strokes. Depression is a big thing. I always remember one day I was had a drug salesman walk into my office selling one of the new selective serotonin uptake inhibitors. And his selling point that day was, this is great to treat the depression that people on birth control pills have. Mm-hmm. I said, how sad is it that we've so accepted that everybody's going to be on hormonal contraceptives that we now have to have a new class of medication just to treat the side effects? Yeah.
Is the depression caused by the hormones from the birth control, or is it a result of something else?
Probably both. Certainly suppression and especially the artificial progesterones do have an influence on the way serotonin is metabolized. So there is that. And there's also, you have to look at individuals. I think we also have a lot of studies that show depression among people who are sexually active outside of marriage or in irregular relationships. But that's another talk all in itself. But it's both. IUDs, primarily abortifacient, especially the copper-containing IUDs, because they prevent implantation and they don't alter ovulation and hence don't block conception. Just they risk themselves increased infections, increased pain with their periods, and chance of perforation. And my partner didn't place this IUD. My partner does contraceptive management for patients. But just the other day, he ended up taking a woman into surgery because her IUD had perforated a bowel. Those things happen. People get really sick. So we've got all these things that can happen with Essure. Essure is the little coil that goes up into the uterine horns. The FDA recently put out a black box warning because there's so many side effects with this, including pain and perforation, probably metal allergies with people being allergic to the copper in the coils. But they're making the company do more studies on safety. But there's all the medical facts that we can that we can educate people and tell them NFP makes sense. As we're talking about birth control controversy, in just the last couple of weeks, California passed a law that says the pharmacist can now distribute contraceptives without a physician prescription. ACOG, which is the American Congress of OBGYN, is celebrating that, while the California Medical Association is not so sure and thinks that it's dangerous to, and I tend to agree with the California Medical Association because women are in particular, because face it, most contraceptives deal with women, that they're now being able to get drugs that have side effects without even an examination or a chance for proper counseling. It's just the whole mentality of secular mentality, though. NFP, though, if we look at it, we've talked about it being effective, but if we're Catholic, I think the more important thing to look at, and the thing that convinced me, is not only because of the side effects of hormonal contraception, but because of what the Church really says. And I think we have a variety of writings to help us confirm that. If we really look, we can start just with Genesis and know that God created us in His image, and male and female, He created us. But what does that all say? God's greatest gift to us is allowing us to join in the gift of creation. God Himself is family with Father, Son, and Spirit. But if we're made in the image of God, and He calls us to share in creation, there is no act that's holier than marital union. There's no time we're more like God, and there's no time we're holier. And yet our society has cheapened the act into a hookup generation. God loves us fully and freely and fruitfully. That's the way we should love each other, and that's what's meant for marriage. And when you really think about that and contemplate that and pray about that, using anything that blocks that love really seems to block Christ out of your life. And it's all about Christ. Everything, the apostolic exhortation, the wanting to do, practicing NFP, all the writings of Humana Vitae, all bring us back to the fact that Christ loves us. And He wants us to love Him back. Why else would God have created man in the first place? God is infinite. God has everything. God doesn't need us. But the love between the Father and Son is so intimate, so immense, that all of heaven couldn't contain that love. So He created us to share in that love. And I can't imagine anything anybody else would want. It's the greatest thing in the world to know that He loves us, and He wants us to love Him back. Why would we not want to share that message of love and tell people that the marital act, the marriage and family is the way God wants us to experience that here and to share? It's amazing. I think that's what we want to tell people. And I think as we share apologetics and the new evangelization, that's what we're called to do. I haven't always practiced as an NFP only. In fact, I was kind of one of those very liberal, strong, outspoken, and bitchy women, if you really want to admit that too. I thought that birth control was necessary because I thought big families were silly, irresponsible. I thought that birth control was what everybody did, and it didn't really occur to me, even though I was raised Catholic, it didn't make sense that you wouldn't. It was just taken for granted. All my education, everything always told me that that's what people do, and that it's the right way. During my, when I finally met my husband, we were at an engaged encounter, and there was a NFP lecture, brief one, and I was just, that poor priest, I ripped him apart. I can't believe how cruel I was to him, but my heart wasn't open to God. during my training, while I never was pro-abortion, I was not very well formed. And when it came to the point where we were supposed to learn how to do them and be involved and evaluate people, I didn't have enough of a backbone to say no. And so I was involved with abortions, and it wasn't until I actually did one that I realized the depth of my depression and the pain in my soul to admit that I could do that. I actually came pretty close to being suicidal. Had a plan, but somehow or another the image of our Virgin Mother came to me and prevented me from acting on it. So I have to thank Mary for saving my life back then. But I still continued to prescribe birth control, and I never made a connection about the sanctity of life and the sanctity of openness to life. I didn't know that they were connected at all. I met my husband, who wasn't Catholic, and eventually we had 2 boys, contracepted in between. And when our boys got old enough to ask, are we going to Dad's church or Mom's church? My husband said, okay, I'll look into the Catholic Church, but wasn't very enthusiastic about it. Went through our CIA, and fortunately I went with him, and I, for the first time, really learned what the church was about, and started opening up to different ideas and learning more about the faith. And kind of things just chipped away at me a little at a time. And I'm so grateful. There was our priest back in South Dakota who really started challenging me about the way I practiced and prescribed birth control. And we had friendly arguments, but I particularly had a hard time understanding when a woman was really sick and another pregnancy could really hurt her, why we shouldn't contracept at that point. And he eventually challenged me to go to an Academy of American Fertility Practitioners, which is the medical arm of the Creighton Society's annual meeting. And I agreed to go, only because I thought it would get him off my back if I went that way. And I was reading Humana Vitae at that point. And what an amazing thing, because I've been going to medical meetings for years and years and years by that point. And it really struck me as odd, but kind of cool, because they started their meetings with Mass every morning. And it kind of showed me that actual trained doctors can meld their field and their faith, because that never occurred to me. They seemed so far apart before. I prayed for sick patients, but boy, you know what, when you're an OBGYN and you deal with sexual issues the whole time, faith and sex just didn't seem to go together for me. And like our society, our secular society, those things don't belong in the same room, and that's the way my brain was wired at the time. But at one point during that, I was reading Humana Vitae, and I started reading that Paul VI said that men would lose respect for women, that we'd have more divorce, that there would be more violence, that there would be an increase in the abortion rate. And it hit me like a ton of bricks that was all true. And the Holy Spirit really, literally poured that on me like oceans, and realized at that point that everything the church said was true. And I fell on my knees in that hotel room in Florida, and I literally said, oh my God, you're true. And I was flooded, absolutely flooded with remorse for the way I had lived and the way I practiced medicine. And also at the same time with love. And amazed at this feeling of knowledge that I think was about to set me free from chains I didn't even realize that I wore. But tears kept coming and coming and coming. And the beautiful thing about where this happened is there were so many other physicians that had gone through similar things. And I was so blessed to spend a couple hours with another doctor who told me his story. And he'd had a strong conversion as well. And he had to tell his wife the day after, he goes, either I don't go to work today or I go to work and commit 24 mortal sins. It's that whole bit of knowing the difference. But I knew after that time that I had to stop because the truth was so real. And even though I say that we can find all kinds of medical reasons that birth control can harm people, it was the love of God that moved me, and not the medical knowledge. It was the societal harms, I think, that moved me more than the medical risks, about how it's hurting families and hurting marriages. And I kept crying. I called my partner back in South Dakota at that point and said, you got to cancel my tubal ligation that I'm supposed to do Monday morning because I can't do that anymore. And I came home, and my husband had been trained as a chef before, and he was actually doing a priest dinner that night that I got home. And so I went over to the rectory where he was cooking for a bunch of priests, and I grabbed our pastor, and I mean, my first order was to gain confession. And my first order on Monday morning was to have somebody remove my IUD. But I kept crying, and I didn't know exactly what that all meant. My reception back at work after that weekend was not wonderful. People said I had to be stopped, and nobody could understand. And I was having a hard time understanding it myself. A few days later, we were at a meeting in our clinic, and it was time for renewal of contracts, and everybody got a contract except me. And I was told before they could even consider renewing my contract, I had to meet with the big regional board to explain how I could be an OB-GYN and not tie tubes or prescribe birth control. I was pretty nervous about that, but in between the whole thing, I was crying every day, uncontrollably crying. And the day before I had the meeting with the board, it was a Sunday, and I had to make rounds in Sturgis, South Dakota before I went back home to Spearfish where I practiced. And it's about a half-hour drive. And I remember starting to pray as I drove out of Sturgis, and I said, Jesus, I'm trying to live my life the way you want, and I told him I loved him. And I said, will you help me with this meeting? And I said, if you can't help me with this meeting, will you at least tell me why I keep crying and can't stop? And suddenly, excuse me, I just had this sense or this vision or this awake dream, I don't know what I want to call it, but I saw Christ being scourged. And he was just standing there taking it. And I kept hearing with every blow of the whip and everything that was getting him, I heard people telling him, you have no right to interfere with reproductive rights, and you have no right to stop abortion, and just screaming at him all the things that I used to say. And all of a sudden I heard it was my own voice screaming at our Lord and scourging him. And it scared me, but I suddenly knew that I never ever want to hurt the Lord again. And the next thing I knew, I was standing in his arm, but the scourging was going on from others. But he held me, and he protected me, and he held me up during the whole time. And I've never, ever, and never will again in this life feel that much love. God loves us so much. It was a feeling like I've never had before. And after that, tears still come every time I think of it. But it's okay, because these are tears of knowing it's all about Christ. And it's all about our relationship with Christ. The next thing I knew, that we were taken to another spot, and the scourging was done, but Christ was standing, and now Christ was weeping. You know, during the scourging, he was strong, and there wasn't a moment of weakness. It was, he just took it. He took our sin. But now he was weeping, and Mary was right behind him. And I looked and to where he was gazing, and there were souls floating on the air without direction. There were some that were pushing them over into the pit. But a lot of them just didn't know where they were going. And Christ was weeping because he's there with open arms trying to love them and wants him to come. But he can't force them. You have to come on your own to embrace his love. Some were trying to help him and guide him toward Christ. And I think it was showing me, and this happened before all the talk of the new evangelization, but I really think that's what that message was, is that he wants us to help other people and other souls to find him, and to help fight off the ones that would push his precious loved ones down away from him. And I think that's what we still need to do. I just want to share that with you. I know personal revelations, they're personal. Nobody has to believe it, and I'm not pushing that on anyone. But it was a pretty amazing half hour, and one that's just was going to continue to live on. I honestly don't know how I drove during that, because I don't remember anything about driving as I was driving from one town to the other. Ultimately, I went to my meeting the next day. I was still feeling pain on my back from the scourging. No marks, but I felt the burn for weeks and weeks after that. I cried through the meeting, and ultimately I was told that it would be best if we parted with my employer at the time, that it would be best if we parted ways. I tried running an NFP-only clinic on my own for a while, but I think I'm a lot better doctor than I am a business person. Ultimately, we went bankrupt. We lost our house and all our possessions, but that's okay, because that was another lesson. It was real hard finding a job after that, though. There aren't that many openings for OB-GYNs that don't tie tubes or prescribe birth control pills. It was kind of funny. A few years before this all happened, I was planning a vacation, and my employer said they'd get somebody, because I didn't have coverage at the time because I didn't have a partner. They said that they'd hire somebody temporarily so I could go on this 2-week vacation, and made plans. And when they found out how much it cost for temporary help, they said, all of a sudden they weren't going to pay for it. And at that point, just in anger, I contacted an international locum tenens company and said, if they aren't going to get me help, I'm going to go be somebody else's help. But I never really thought I'd do international locum tenens. It was just something I did. That company used to call me once or twice a year to see if I was interested. It's funny, about the time that we were going through the bankruptcy, they started calling me once a week. I mean, there's no coincidences with God. I couldn't find a job, and so my husband and I and our boys, who were 12 and 14 at the time, moved to New Zealand. And I said, my husband always calls that his time in the desert. And yeah, the amazing thing is, it was a stressful time, but our marriage grew stronger than ever before. My husband and I were doing NFP at that point, and truly, truly, all we could do is put our trust in the Lord. And I don't think we had a good marriage before, but it just was so strengthened. I'm so grateful to God for the man He put in my life. During all that I said, it was just pretty amazing. My husband discerned his call to the diaconate at that point as well. And from someone who hadn't even wanted to be Catholic and went through RCIA very grudgingly, faith was so strengthened. We were there for about a year, and we started looking for jobs because, our home is America. Our families are here. I initially started looking through Catholic Health Services for work, and I was woefully disappointed because almost everybody said, nobody really wants doctors that practice that way, and even if they had the UCCB's instructions for healthcare on their website, they'd say, oh, that's just a suggestion. No, so I couldn't find any work in a Catholic healthcare system. But Little Grants, New Mexico would accept us the way I practiced. And, there's the bonus, we don't have to scoop as much snow. And they had a diaconate program that didn't have any restrictions and was open and active. So, lo and behold, we ended up in Grants, New Mexico. My husband went through diaconate formation, and fortunate I got to go through some of his sessions with him. And again, more reasons that our faith gets deeper and deeper. He was ordained about 1.5 years ago. So I just feel so very blessed to be here. I still practice as an NFP only. My practice isn't limited to people seeking that. I still do regular OB, and as I said, I see people who claim to be Catholic but don't practice it, and I so understand it because I lived so much of my life that way. But just waiting for the little opportunity to let them know that God loves them. There's an opening and a way to tell them. We have our 2 boys who are both going to college in Santa Fe now. John is 22 and he's going to graduate next month. He's got a music degree. I think it's hilarious. He went there because he plays mandolin and he loved bluegrass. And they had a contemporary music department at the University of Santa Fe for Art and Design. But he went there and he fell in love with sacred music. So last year at this fall, right in November, for his recital to finish his contemporary music degree, his program consisted of Gregorian chant, Palestrina, Monteverdi. So he's gone another way, and I'll ask for your prayers for him too, because he's got his application to seminary done. Other than he has to go next week, he has to have his evaluation with the psych eval. That's a prerequisite for that. So prayers for my boy, if you don't mind. Our younger son is a film major, and he's a sophomore, and doesn't quite know what he wants to do with it yet, but that's okay. And hopefully he'll find his way, and we just pray for him also that he keeps God plan for him in his life. But here we are. Everything I do still professionally still revolves around things that involve sex. And whoever, I never could have imagined in my wildest dreams that I found Christ because of sex. But now I realize I can't separate those. And it's the most beautiful thing I could have ever imagined. And That's my story. If you guys have questions about anything related to that or about NFP or anything else, I'll open it up for questions at this point.
What's the secular argument you use against contraceptions that aren't chemical?
About that aren't chemical?
Aren't chemical.
A secular argument I use, if we're talking first of all about barrier methods, that they don't work, that they're ineffective. Condom use, let's take condom use. You know, they'll talk about 85% effective, theoretical. But the truth of the matter is, it's much less than that. If you took two cohabitating teens who used condoms as their birth control, at the end of a year, 75% of them will have an unplanned pregnancy. There's other things you can throw in too. Did you know that it's actually has to do with sexual response? There's a lot of testosterone in seminal fluid. And there are studies that show that testosterone crosses the vaginal barrier and actually improves sexual response in women. And so, all the time you would hear stories about condoms interfering with men's sexual response. Well, there's studies that show that it interferes with women's sexual response too. And it's okay to share that. And I say, in the context of marriage, sex should be bonding. And it should be reinforcing. And if we're doing things that interfere with the bonding aspect, it's counterintuitive. So barrier methods, we use those things. IUDs, I still talk about them being abortifacient as well as the risk of perforations and infections.
How successful is NFP, if you don't know? I guess percentage.
The study done by the World Health Organization it was primarily based on symptodermal. There's different methods between symptodermal and mucus only. But it was in excess of 95% effective. And so it's very comparable to hormonal contraceptions, pills, rings. The biggest thing we're seeing right now in terms of hormonal contraception are the LARC program. There's not a day goes by that ACOG doesn't send me an email about long-acting reversible contraception. And that's the implants, the Nexplanon, and the progesterone-containing IUDs. The thing that I argue with that is percentage of continuation. They're very expensive methods, but people have pain, they have depression, and they have irregular bleeding. And probably 60% of them ask for them to be removed before their expired time. And I think there's a discontinuation rate of 30% within the first 3 months of use, because people don't feel good on them. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
On the same vein, I've seen a lot of mainstream news sources state that the actual effectiveness of NFP is closer to 65%. Where are they getting that number from?
Well, part of it I alluded to is there are places, secular places, not the ones, Creighton doesn't teach it, Billings doesn't teach it, Couple to Couple League doesn't teach it, but part of it is BAFTing, and that people should use other methods during their fertile time. That's part of the failure rate. But if you think about it, if you know that you've got a potential to conceive at this time, and you use a barrier method, which we just said barrier methods don't work very well, the failure rate at that point is really that of the barrier method, not of the NFP. So we're talking about if you use it properly. Now, obviously, there's disagreement about how to define if it's being properly used and if that's a failure rate. So, if a couple says, you know what, we're not ready for a child now, and they go out and maybe they've been out on a date or, even a married date if the case may be, and they've had a few and they've lost their inhibition, is that a failure rate of the NFP method if they're being intimate during a fertile time? Because technically if you have sex during a fertile time, you're using the method to achieve rather than avoid. And so people that do statistics on natural family planning would not call that a method failure. They would talk about a misuse, but not a method failure. Yeah.
I was curious if you know of any studies about the typical use of effectiveness of abstinence?
Abstinence.
Like, you not married, abstinence completely.
Abstinence as a birth control.
As a birth control.
Because they're important, because obviously, as you know,
100%
explain.
effective.
So everyone else knows, so there's two types of effectiveness reported whenever, in the scientific literature, whenever a birth control method is studied. One is the perfect use effectiveness,
Right.
and the other one is the typical use effectiveness.
Right.
And so the thing is, when you prescribe things to a patient as a doctor, what's going to happen clinically is the typical use effectiveness is what you're going to see among your patients, and that's what you're going to see among the population as a whole. But then the perfect use, the people who do everything properly, use it right, that's very different, and it's only an ideal situation. And so Gail was asking if there has been any study as to what the typical use effectiveness is of abstinence versus, obviously we know the perfect use is.
I'm not aware of that number. Are you?
No,
No,
I haven't been able to find it anywhere.
no,
It's
I have
always
not.
None assigned when they show the little
Right,
charts with
right. Haven't been able to see that. I always want to talk about, though, and bear in mind when we have that discussion that we should realize there's a difference between abstinence and chastity. And I would be very much willing to bet that if you use chastity, it would be a lot more effective than if you would do it abstinence. Because abstinence talks about that as being self-imposed. Chastity, as we talk about it, is a gift from God. And so it's not humanly self-imposed, it's supernaturally reinforced. And so I think there's a huge difference there. Yeah.
Well, I'm in pharmacy school, and we have been talking about HIV positive patients, and that we should tell them all that they should be using condoms to prevent spread. What does the church teach in that way?
Well, the church still says we shouldn't use condoms, and the church would talk about chastity in that instance. And, well, let's talk about it. HIV is obviously one of the most serious sexually transmitted disease we have. But if you look at it, transmission between if you have a woman with HIV who has sex with a man who doesn't have HIV, the chances of transmitting the disease are about 1 in 4 or 500 per encounter. Okay, obviously more encounters. So as much as the studies, as much as the secular media wants to tell you that this is a big heterosexual disease, it really is transmitted more by anal intercourse. Because the rectum breaks when you shove things in there. It's supposed to be a method for evacuation, not a receptacle. And the rectal mucosa is not strong enough, so it tears. And it's the tear that allows the transmission of the virus. That's why HIV remains a disease that's still largely among the homosexual population. And if it's in the heterosexual population, more often than not, it was transmitted through anal intercourse. And so the Catholic Church should not be afraid to say that sodomy is harmful physically, spiritually, because anal intercourse is not open to life, right? So from a theologic point of view, we should argue against that as well. And I think we want to go back that, yes, HIV is out there, but our whole goal is how are we going to decrease HIV? It's to go back to the basics and decrease multiple partners. And we may have to call on some people in the meantime when they're infected to be chaste. That's going to be our view.
Can I respond a little bit to your question, Tiana, if that's okay? So, Pope Benedict, he was talked about a lot in the media. So one thing that he said, I believe specifically, was roughly along the lines of, when a man who's having intercourse with a homosexual prostitute uses a condom, it can be like an opening to like greater love for others than for self, and so it can be an inroad for charity. And so that specific quote of his was taken a bit out of context to suggest that the Pope was saying that condoms can be used to prevent transmission of HIV. And with what, but in that line of thought, in what Dr. Church was talking about, in homosexual intercourse, which again in the United States, over 50% of the population of HIV positive patients you're going to be dealing with are going to be men who have sex with men. And so the main issue with our issue with barrier methods and with unnatural sexual acts as Catholics is that it frustrates the natural purpose of sexual relations. And so if your typical patient who's HIV positive will probably be a man who has sex with men. So at least in terms of those interactions, using a barrier method is somewhat effective in reducing the transmission of HIV, but again, typical use, not nearly perfect. But I do know that the nature of the sexual act in that case is already deformed beyond its beyond what it is supposed to be. So it doesn't actually change anything for them. So in a practical sense, I'm not an ethicist, I can't speak for the church, but in a practical sense, I would say that I don't necessarily see the difference for your typical HIV positive patient about advising them that if they are going to be engaging in sexual behaviors such as anal intercourse between men, that they should use a barrier method because it will reduce their chances. But I will say that as a public health measure in Africa, studies increasing the distribution of condoms seems to have a slight negative correlation with transmission rates of HIV.
Slight.
Yeah. Well, when I say negative correlation, I mean that you increase the distribution of condoms and you increase the transmission of HIVs.
Right.
And then I have a question about the method of action of intrauterine devices. So my understanding, as I've been taught in med school, and as I've read the scientific literature, is that the rate of the rate of ovulation among users of hormonal IUDs is very, very much very low. And one study that they cited, they collected the uterine flushings from women, and they found no eggs coming from the women with the intrauterine devices, and the women who did not have them.
How did they do those studies?
Sorry?
How did they do those studies?
So the specific one that I'm talking about right now, I have right here. So they had women. So yes, what they did is they had women with IUDs and women without IUDs, and so they looked at the peak of their luteinizing hormone. And they collected tubal flushings, and they found.
Well, how did they do tubal flushings? Let's talk about the methodology here. How do you do tubal flushings?
I'm not entirely certain how they did it in this case.
Exactly. So let's talk about how long does an egg live if it's unfertilized?
It depends on the egg, obviously, but I think it can be as little as 1 day, depending on the person, as much as a week, but probably.
No, anywhere from 12 to 36 hours. Okay. So when are they doing these flushings? How are they doing these flushings? I think we have to really question their methodology. Are these women all being subjected to a laparoscopy? Are they flushing it and then, yeah, I say, and then collecting it laparoscopically or through a coldocentesis where they would put a needle into the cul-de-sac and suck the fluid out? There's a lot of questions about the methodology and knowing. So those studies are suspect.
And I mean, that's not the only one. I know that there's ones they've done with rhesus monkeys, where the rate of deformed embryos that they collect that don't implant is the same as the rate in the rhesus monkeys that don't have the IUDs implanted in them. And so there's no difference between them, but the rate of unfertilized eggs that they catch out of the rhesus monkeys with IUDs is also much, much lower.
So, and we're talking about copper IUDs?
I think that the rhesus monkeys specifically, that was copper IUDs. The curse was the one who did that study.
Right, so the other thing with IUDs, obviously it doesn't stop ovulation. It does alter tubal transport with just a local inflammatory response from the copper.
Mm.
So the amount of eggs that would get down to the uterus should be decreased.
Mm.
That's also why if there is a pregnancy with the IUD in place, the rates of tubal pregnancies is higher, right? So yeah, the method of action is implantation, but also tubal transport.
My understanding with the tubal pregnancy rate being higher is that it had to do with the older studies on the copper IUDs, which they didn't control for the number of sexual partners, and so they had a higher rate of the history of pelvic inflammatory disease. And so that would explain why they had higher rates of ectopic pregnancies. That's what I heard was the explanation.
So method issue too, or bias.
I mean, if you would like to direct me specifically to any scientific studies on the issue that show direct interference with implantation, I'd be happy to look at them. But I'm not aware of ones that are conclusive.
I'll have to get back to you on that. Do you have an email address?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
I think I've actually emailed you in the past because I used to be a director of Cafe, so I think I might have that in my history. Your email address, my Gmail account.
Okay. Sorry if I don't recall. What is your name again?
Paul Hunt.
I'm sorry?
Paul Hunt.
Okay. Just send me your email address,
Okay.
and if not, I'll send you mine too, okay?
Okay.
You're in med school now?
I am, yes.
What year?
Third year.
Okay. And what are your plans?
I'd like to do orthopedics.
Okay.
And on that topic, if I wanted to be Catholic OB-GYN, I don't see myself doing that, then because obviously I believe everything the church teaches to be true, absolutely, and would never, ever want to do anything that violated the church's ethical beliefs. Which OB-GYN residency programs would I be able to survive that?
I'm thinking of a couple in Texas. I think you can survive at in St. Louis.
That's slow?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
Creighton.
There's a couple. Yeah, I don't even know if you can survive at Creighton.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can survive.
That's
at
unfortunate.
Creighton. There's a couple small private places in upstate New York, at least one. I'm thinking of locations, but I don't have a list of them on me, so.
Okay. I'm just curious if there were options.
Because there are many.
I'm not planning to go
They're
into
few and
OB-GYN,
far
so.
between. Few and far between, but some.
And so we have time for one more question if someone has a pressing concern. This one might be too complex for you to answer in the short time that we have left, Dr. Church. But one thing that I've encountered is that more and more people have sort of developed this contempt for children.
Yes.
That that they have no interest, they have no desire. That a family is never an option for them. I don't I don't necessarily know how to wrap my head around that one. In that, you know, if you know you're biologically ordered towards producing future generations, could you elaborate on, you know, some of the history that has led up to this mentality? But it's been, I don't know, sort of a disturbing experience to talk with people about this.
It is, and I wish I could. I'm probably not well read.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't considered that very much. I recently had a chance to hear a lecture on that, and left the lecture and said I have to read more, but that hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I can't. I wish I could answer your question, but I can't.
I mean, but it's not like this disdain for human life and for children. It's not like it's an incredibly new thing. I mean, like, look at the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks and how they would practice, like, they'd have their methods for contraception and abort babies, and even going back to the times of, like, ancient times where they'd have child sacrifice. So, I mean, there's always been people that have this disdain for human life, even in its earliest.
If there's anything else, then, well, thank you very much, Dr. Church, for coming on this evening.